I have a question. Guess which of this is China? Most of you will probably say the right side, and you'll say the left side is Taiwan. Well, it's actually more complicated than that. The left one actually considers itself the Republic of China, and the right one considers itself the People's Republic of China. They consider themselves as the only China, and their relationship is incredibly complicated. This begs us the question, how did this come to be? And who really is China? The name China is the English name for the Chinese 中国, which means middle country. The English term is believed to have come from Middle Persian and ultimately from the Chinese word Qin, the name of the dynasty that is known for first unifying much of today's Chinese heartland, since Chinese history is that of unity and disunity at times. The name may also have other potential sources, and there are also many historical names for China in the Chinese language. Now, there are several terms that refer to China depending on the context. As said earlier, it can refer to the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, and the Republic of China, or the ROC. The PRC is what we generally refer to as China, and that is because it currently controls mainland China. Mainland China is a geopolitical term defined by the territory directly governed by the PRC, and by the definition, special administrative regions like Hong Kong and Macau are generally not included. Territories ruled by the Republic of China are not included as well. Mainland China is massive, contains major economic and industrial hubs like Shanghai and Shenzhen, and it hosts the capital of the PRC, Beijing. However, the Hainan Island is geographically not connected to the rest of mainland China, but the PRC exercises full control, so in a geopolitical context, Hainan is generally included as part of mainland China despite not being connected geographically. The usage of the term mainland referencing mainland China may vary though. The PRC is also referred to as New China, Communist China, and Red China. There is also the term called China proper, also known as Inner China, which refers to the core heartland of the Chinese civilization, mostly populated by the Han Chinese, and areas mostly populated by ethnic minorities like Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and Xinjiang, known as frontier regions or Outer China, are not included. There is no fixed geographical extent, and these may vary greatly. Aside from the PRC, there is also the ROC, or the Republic of China. We generally refer to this as simply Taiwan because it really controls the island of Taiwan, but it also controls some islands near mainland China, such as the Kinmen and Matsu Islands. The ROC government and many pro-Taiwanese people would refer to it as Free China or Nationalist China. Chinese Taipei would also be used when representing the ROC at the Olympics and some international forums, mainly due to the pressure from the PRC. The main issue here is that both the ROC and the PRC both claim to be the sole legal China, and the status quo continues to be very tense, with the ROC being very defiant despite the massive size and power of the PRC. The main question is how this came to be, and why are there two Chinas vying for the sole legal China? Well, as mentioned, Chinese history is that of unity and disunity, and this has been going on since like the dawn of man. The same goes for the imperial rule by different dynasties in China, but this came to an end with the 1911 revolution and the establishment of the Republic of China by Sun Yat-sen. Republican rule was turbulent, with many regional warlords vying for supremacy, and it wasn't until Chiang Kai-shek's consolidation when the Republic had nominal control over much of China under the Kuomintang. Meanwhile, a certain German man thought that the proletariat should overthrow the ruling class, and a certain Mao Zedong loved his ideas. And he was further inspired by Lenin and his actions. He would eventually become a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party. At first, they collaborated with the Kuomintang, as they were also supported by the new Soviet Union, but ideological differences set the seeds for conflict. The Chinese Civil War erupted between the Kuomintang, or the nationalists, and the CCP, or the communists, a long and protracted civil war. The CCP's PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, was fully supported by the Soviet Union, which was instrumental in their survival. The massive retreat of the communist forces, also known as the Long March, allowed them to regroup, and it also solidified Mao Zedong as their undisputable leader. However, when the Japanese eyed up the region and invaded, the Kuomintang and the CCP were forced to set aside their differences to face the greater Japanese threat, but they remained suspicious of each other. The CCP strengthened its base during the war, and by 1945, the Red Army has grown to over 1 million members. I mean, the Chinese Red Army, huh? After Japan was defeated, the Civil War resumed, but the communists managed to triumph over the mainland, and the nationalists were forced to retreat to the island of Taiwan, declaring Taipei as the temporary capital of the Republic of China. Eventually, the People's Republic of China was established in Beijing, controlling the entire mainland China and the island of Hainan. There were many battles in the offshore islands of mainland China between the PRC and the ROC, with some of them being successfully taken over by the PRC. However, US formal support, their failure to take the Kinmen Islands, and the fact that amphibious warfare is a lot more complicated prevented the PRC from launching a full-scale invasion of the remaining territory controlled by the Republic of China. That doesn't mean the PRC lost hope of fully defeating the ROC, because they still are. They only eventually became distracted by the Korean War, which saw direct combat between Chinese and American troops. When the Korean War ended up in a stalemate, the PRC turned its attention back to the ROC, and they shelled the Quemoy Islands, and took over the Yijiangshan and Dachin Islands as a show of force, starting the first Taiwan Strait crisis, because fun fact, there are 2 more so far. This prompted the US to formally commit to Taiwan's defense if it was invaded by Chinese forces. The second Taiwan Strait crisis occurred in 1958 when the PRC shelled the Kinmen and Matsu Islands, still controlled by the ROC. And somehow they would also shell propaganda leaflets at the islands. Of course, US support secured Taiwan's integrity. Also, it's not only the PRC that attempted to militarily take over the ROC, but the reverse is true. In the 1960s, Chiang Kai-shek attempted to retake mainland China through Project National Glory, but to no avail. Both the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China have a complicated situation at the international level. In the UN, the ROC was recognized as legitimate China. This is important because China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and the ROC held that role until 1971 when the UN voted to recognize the PRC as legitimate China. The status of the ROC eventually became more complicated as more and more countries are switching recognition to the PRC, because really it's the larger one. But many countries continue to have unofficial relations with the ROC. Well, you can't actually choose to recognize both. You only have to choose between the ROC and the PRC because they both claim to be the sole legal China. Today, only a handful of countries continue to recognize the ROC as the sole legal China. However, as time progressed, both the ROC and the PRC attempted to negotiate to open some economic ties and diplomatic channels, as the PRC hoped to regain the ROC through diplomatic means, as they had successfully done with Hong Kong and Macau. As the ROC became more democratic, the Taiwanese question shifted to the choice between political unification with mainland China, retaining the status quo of two Chinas, or total Taiwanese independence. This is because over time, a Taiwanese identity is slowly developing among the Taiwanese population, and many began advocating for Taiwanese independence. Prior to the 1990s, the ROC had been an authoritarian one-party state committed to the One China principle. But when democratization came, where student movements for democracy actually had a headway, unlike in the ROC's western neighbor, Taiwanese nationalism became increasingly included in the ROC government agenda. In the 1990s, the PRC initiated the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, intended to intimidate the ROC, which was preparing to have its first presidential election. Beijing made it pretty clear that it will use brute force if the ROC pursued total independence. Afterward, relations vary from hostile non-contact to limited cooperation in negotiations and trade. Recently, though, relations reached a new low when Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party won the 2016 elections, coinciding with the rise of Xi Jinping in Beijing, who is considerably more aggressive than his predecessors, especially concerning Taiwan. The PLA Air Force began to increasingly violate ROC's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, and there are analysts who believe that the PRC will pursue and is capable of pursuing an invasion of Taiwan within the following years or decades. Xi Jinping made it pretty clear that Taiwan belongs to them, and whether he will use military force to make it happen is up for speculation. What I mean by military force is a full-scale invasion, by the way. Oh, and yeah, Nancy Pelosi did a thing, and she visited the Republic of China in defiance of its Western neighbor, who certainly did not view it favorably. This is certainly a new development, and it will shape the Cross-Strait geopolitical calculus. Practically, most people and countries, except the ROC and those who favor the ROC, recognize and consider the People's Republic of China as China, since most of us refer to it as simply China. The UN will also say the same thing, since it's the People's Republic of China that legally represents China at the UN. No, this is not an attempt to gain social credits, by the way. The main matter of interest is the Republic of China because its international position is very complicated and is often considered a nominally independent country but in a state of limbo diplomatically. The PRC continues to hold the One China principle, where the PRC is the sole legitimate government of China, and that Taiwan is part of that China. And it rejects the notion that there are two Chinas. The US and many Western countries acknowledge that the PRC is the sole legal government of China, but do not explicitly endorse the notion that Taiwan is part of China, and it practically rejects the notion that Taiwan is PRC territory. The Pan-Blue coalition of the ROC, which includes Kuomintang, still adheres to the One China principle, but with respective interpretations, while the Pan-Green coalition, which includes the Democratic Progressive Party, does not, and prefers separation from China, and it has Taiwanese independence as the ultimate end goal. The term Taiwanese independence, though, can be interpreted as the notion that Taiwan is already independent as the Republic of China, or the notion that there should be an independent Taiwanese state. Now, there are multiple ways to settle the current situation between the ROC and the PRC, with some being realistic or unrealistic. There could be a full Chinese reunification with either the ROC or the PRC government. Let the ROC join the PRC under one country, two systems policy, which happened with Hong Kong and Macau. Apply the three principles of the people in Chinese reunification. Formally abolish the ROC in favor of an independent Taiwanese state, or if diplomatic options ran out, resort to force, either through a full-scale invasion or hybrid warfare. These options are not off the table, and the current geopolitical outlook will shape cross-strait relations. Overall, the question of who is China depends on the context. If it's in a geographical context, we may be inclined to say PRC or just mainland China, because it controls all of mainland China, and we may refer to the ROC as Taiwan. If it's in the legal and diplomatic context, the answer is ambiguous and very complicated, as the PRC and ROC still both consider themselves to be the sole legal China. If it's in the political context, well, it depends on your politics. If you are a pro-Chinese Communist Party and are striving for social credit points, you will definitely say China is PRC and Taiwan is part of China under the PRC. If you are a generally liberal and progressive person that is in favor of Taiwan, you will definitely say Taiwan is not part of China under the PRC. If you are a hardcore Kuomintang and a great fan of Chiang Kai-shek, you will definitely say Taiwan is China and it's the ROC who rules China, and maybe even some additional adjacent territory if you wish. Well, it's not made up, since those were the official claims of the ROC. Certainly, there is no definite exact answer that everyone can agree on, because well, it's geopolitics. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more Country Neighbors. No armistice nor peace treaty has ever been signed for the Chinese Civil War, by the way.